The wind dragged across the barren hills as though the land itself were gasping for breath, struggling under the weight of a darkness that had slowly swallowed the nation. A silence had settled over Israel, not a peaceful silence, but one that felt haunted, as if the very soil remembered what it once was, and now mourned what it had become. Idols stood on hilltops that once echoed with songs of worship to the God who brought their ancestors out of Egypt. Altars built for false gods rose like monuments of betrayal, and the hearts of the people beat for things that could not breathe, could not speak, could not save. Amid this spiritual ruin, the palace of Samaria gleamed with the pride of a king who believed himself untouchable. Ahab sat on his throne, confident in the strength of alliances he had made with nations that did not know the God of Israel. But behind him, like a shadow that ruled more fiercely than any crown, stood the queen whose very name turned brave men into trembling fugitives. She had not come with promises of peace or unity. She had come with a mission, a fire burning in her eyes that sought to consume every trace of the God of Israel. Jezebel's devotion to Baal was not a quiet belief. It was an iron fist, wrapped in velvet commands that reshaped the kingdom according to her will. Walls that had once held sacred history now echoed with chants to a god made of wood. Priests, dressed in foreign garments, walked boldly through streets where prophets once spoke truth. The people did not realize the slow poisoning of their souls. They bowed because their king bowed. They followed because their queen demanded it. And with each act of worship to Baal, the light of the true God seemed to grow dimmer in the nation he had chosen. But heaven had not gone silent. God watched as his people strayed, watched as lies replaced truth, watched as fear surrendered to the idols of convenience. And in the midst of a world spiraling into spiritual death, heaven prepared a man whose very presence would tear through the darkness like a bolt of lightning. He did not come from palaces or prestigious families. He had no royal blood, no wealthy lineage. He came from rugged mountains and wilderness, where a man learned to listen more to God's whispers than to human voices. He walked into the throne room without ceremony, without fear, without bowing, because he bowed to someone far greater. When Ahab's eyes fell upon him, he saw not a threat, but an inconvenience, a man out of place in royal surroundings. But the words that cut through the air were not the words of an ordinary man. They were the words of a mouth that had carried heaven's fire. He declared that the skies would close, that the rain would cease, that even the dew would vanish. He spoke as if he held the keys of the heavens, as if God himself had entrusted the weather to his command. And when he said the land would not see a drop of moisture until he spoke again, something in the throne room shifted. There was a power in his voice that sent a tremor through those who heard him. But before anyone could question him or strike him down for his boldness, he was gone. The drought arrived like a thief in the night. At first, people dismissed it as a temporary shift in weather, but days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Crops shriveled under the relentless sun. Streams that had flowed for generations dwindled to muddy trickles. Wells were dug deeper and deeper until the earth offered nothing. The gods of wood and stone were silent in the face of disaster. The prophets of Baal danced and shouted until their voices cracked, but the heavens remained shut. Meanwhile, the man who had declared the drought was hidden in a ravine far from the reach of the king and the queen. The place was barren, lonely, carved into the wilderness as though it had been waiting for him. Each morning, he drank from a brook that flowed stubbornly through the drought-stricken land. And each morning and evening, Birds that should have had no interest in serving a human brought him bread and meat. The ravens came with the discipline of angels, carrying sustenance in their claws. Each day reminded him that the God who controlled the skies could also command creatures considered unclean and unwanted. He lived not by stored grain or human kindness, but by the breath of God himself. And there, in the solitude of the ravine, his faith grew stronger, shaped not by crowds or applause, but by daily dependence on divine provision. But the brook that had kept him alive began to shrink. What once flowed gently now crawled between stones. The drought was fulfilling the very prophecy he had spoken. And when the final drop of water disappeared into the thirsty earth, he waited, not in panic, not in desperation, but in anticipation of the next command. It came like a whisper of destiny. He was told to go to a foreign land, a land soaked in Baal worship, the very birthplace of the queen who sought his life. Sidon was a place where no Israelite prophet should have walked freely, yet he was sent there not to meet a king or a commander, but a widow. Not a wealthy household, but a dying one. Not a feast, but the last crumbs a desperate mother had set aside before surrendering to death. He found her gathering sticks, preparing the painful final act of a mother's love, one last meal for her child before the inevitable hunger consumed them both. Her face carried the exhaustion of grief that had not yet been spoken. He asked her for water, and she moved to bring it. But when he asked for bread, the fragile hope she carried shattered, and she revealed the truth that weighed on her soul. She had only a handful of flour left, a small amount of oil, enough for one final meal. She had accepted death, embraced it with tragic calm. Her son would eat, she would watch him, and then they would wait together for the end. But the prophet who stood before her was not carrying the despair of the drought. He carried the authority of a God who refuses to abandon even those who do not know his name. He told her not to fear. He told her to do the unthinkable, feed him first. And then he spoke a promise that defied logic, defied nature, defied the hopelessness that hung in the air. Her flour would not run out. Her oil would not dry up. Every day, until rain returned, the jars in her home would give what they did not have. Her hands trembled as she baked the bread, but she obeyed. And when she returned to the jars after feeding the stranger, she found what she never expected: more flour, more oil, exactly enough for one more meal. And the next day, the miracle repeated. And the next. The jars did not overflow, but they did not empty. They held not abundance, but constancy, not luxury, but life. And for a while, hope lived in that small home, until death returned, not through hunger, but through sickness. The boy who had been saved from starvation fell ill, and no miracle came to stop it. His breathing weakened, his body grew still, and the widow's world collapsed. She turned on the prophet, blaming him, blaming God, blaming the presence of holiness that she believed had drawn judgment upon her. He did not argue. He took the lifeless child from her arms, carried him to the upper room where he had been staying, and cried out to the God who had fed them day after day. He stretched himself over the boy, not performing a ritual, but pleading with the one who gives breath. His voice trembled with a pain he rarely showed, and heaven answered. Breath returned to the boy. Warmth returned to his skin. Life flowed through him once more. When Elijah carried him back to his mother, she saw not just her son restored, but her faith reborn. She saw in the prophet not a threat, but the undeniable evidence of a God whose power reached into the heart of enemy territory to save a dying child and a broken mother. The years of drought carved themselves into the land until the once green valleys of Israel became an endless sea of dust. Cracked soil stretched like a great wound across the nation, and even the strongest trees bowed under the weight of the relentless sun. People who once laughed freely now whispered in fear, searching for a drop of water, a blade of grass, a sign of hope. But the heavens remained silent, just as the prophet had declared. Every morning the sun rose with an unforgiving glare, and every night the air felt heavier, as if creation itself was suffocating. Farmers stood in their empty fields with hollow eyes, remembering harvests that now felt like dreams. Children cried not from hunger alone, but from a despair they were too young to understand. Those who had trusted in idols found no comfort, for their gods were powerless to stop the famine that swallowed the nation. And the name on everyone's lips was the same: the man who had vanished, the man whose words had shut the sky. Some believed he was dead. Others said he had been taken by the spirits of the wilderness. A few whispered that he still lived, waiting for the moment when God would send him back to unlock the heavens. But there was one man who would have given anything to find him. Obadiah served in the palace of the king, walking daily through halls filled with the influence of a queen who despised the God he secretly worshipped. While Jezebel hunted down every prophet she could find, Obadiah risked his life to hide 100 of them in caves, feeding them with whatever little food he could gather, in a land where food itself had become a treasure. Each day, he lived between two worlds: loyalty to a king who had lost his fear of God, and devotion to the Lord whose presence still whispered through his conscience. One morning, while traveling across the scorched land in search of any remaining water source, he saw a figure walking alone along the barren path. The closer he came, the more his heart pounded with disbelief. The man before him had the unmistakable eyes of someone who carried messages from heaven, eyes that held a fire untouched by drought or fear. It was the prophet everyone had been searching for. Obadiah fell to the ground, overwhelmed by the weight of what he was seeing. He had lived through years of terror, watching Jezebel stain the land with the blood of the innocent, and now the man who had started this divine confrontation stood before him as calm as the breeze that refused to blow. When the prophet told him to announce his return to the king, Obadiah trembled. He knew how unstable Ahab had become, how desperate, how dangerous. The king had searched every nation, every kingdom, demanding oaths from rulers that they were not hiding the prophet. And now that same prophet wanted him to walk into the palace and declare his arrival. But the man's voice carried the same authority that once closed the heavens, and Obadiah obeyed. In the palace, the king who had once dismissed Elijah as a troublemaker now greeted him with the desperation of a man drowning in the consequences of his own rebellion. But the prophet stood unshaken. He did not bow. He did not apologize. He carried the presence of the one who ruled above kings and kingdoms. He called for a gathering unlike anything Israel had seen before, a meeting on a mountain where the lies of Baal worship would be exposed in front of the entire nation. Ahab agreed, driven by a mixture of anger, hope, fear, and pride. And so the nation came to the mountain that towered above the land like a silent witness to centuries of divine history. They climbed the slopes of Carmel, a place where the sea winds touched the earth and where the people could see the land stretched out beneath them, a land dying in silence. Thousands gathered, some curious, some afraid, some exhausted from the weight of famine. At the center of this vast assembly stood the prophets of Baal, dressed in colorful garments designed to impress, their faces painted with arrogance that masked their growing uncertainty. They had boasted for years that their God brought rain, that he controlled storms, that he ruled the skies. But the skies had been silent, the rain had vanished, and now they stood face to face with the man who claimed authority from a God they despised. Elijah stepped forward. His voice rose not with anger, but with sorrow, a sorrow for a nation that had forgotten the one who shaped them, rescued them, cherished them. He questioned the people, asking how long they would waver between two beliefs, how long they would dance between truth and deception. The words struck them like arrows, for deep within their hearts, they knew they had traded glory for emptiness. He proposed a test, not in secret, but before the entire nation. 2 bulls would be offered, 2 altars would be built, 2 cries would rise to the heavens, and the God who answered with fire would be the true God. The prophets of Baal agreed with feigned confidence, surrounding their altar with ritual tools, sacred knives, colorful sashes, and objects that had been believed to hold power. They called out from morning to noon, shouting praises to Baal, chanting rituals that had been passed down through foreign traditions. Their voices filled the mountaintop with a frenzy of cries, yet the air remained empty. No fire answered, no wind stirred, no sign came from the heavens they worshipped. As the hours passed, their shouts turned into screams. They cut themselves until blood ran down their bodies. They danced in circles of madness, trying to force a response from a God made of silence. The prophet watched with a gaze that saw beyond their performance, saw the painful emptiness of worshipping something that had no breath. And then he stepped forward to speak, not out of cruelty, but out of the sorrow that truth brings. His words echoed with a challenge that revealed the futility of their devotion. The prophets of Baal grew frantic, but the day refused to bow to their cries. When the sun reached the late hours of the afternoon, Elijah called the people to come closer. Their eyes followed every movement as he rebuilt an altar that had once been used for the worship of the true God. Stone by stone, he restored what had been torn down by a nation chasing foreign gods. He poured water on the altar, not once or twice, but 3 times, until the trench around it was filled. In a land where water was more precious than gold, pouring it out seemed insane. But the prophet wanted the people to see that what was about to happen would not be a trick, not an illusion, not something that could be explained by man. When he lifted his voice, it was not with shouting or theatrics. It was the quiet voice of a man speaking to a God he knew with the familiarity of a lifetime. His words were simple, humble, yet full of authority. And between one breath and the next, the heavens responded. Fire descended with a roar that shook the mountain. Flames devoured the altar, the stones, the water, the offering, everything. The fire was not random. It was not a spark. It was a declaration, a revelation, a reminder of who truly ruled the heavens and the earth. The people fell on their faces, trembling, weeping, overwhelmed by the sudden glory that had pierced through years of darkness. They cried out, proclaiming the true God with voices that had forgotten how to worship him. What happened next reshaped the spiritual landscape of the nation. The prophets of Baal could no longer hide behind their lies. Their screams echoed across the mountain as judgment fell upon them, and the land began to breathe again. But the prophet was not finished. He climbed back to the mountaintop, where only the sky stretched above him. He bowed low, his face between his knees, praying with the intensity of a man who had carried a nation's destiny in his voice for years. He sent his servant to look toward the sea. Once, nothing. Again, nothing. 7 times the servant climbed and returned until finally he saw something so small it could have been missed. A cloud the size of a man's hand rising slowly from the horizon. The prophet rose, knowing what heaven was about to unleash. The skies that had been silent for years began to gather darkness. Winds rushed across the land. Thunder rolled in the distance. And the first drops of rain in years fell onto the thirsty earth. The drought was ending. The heavens had opened. And the man who ran before the king's chariot carried not fear, but the strength of the God he served. He ran with the rain chasing his heels, with the storm that marked a new beginning, breaking across the land that had suffered under judgment. But even a man who commands the skies can face a moment that tests the deepest parts of his soul. And the shadow of that moment was already approaching, hidden behind the palace walls where a queen's fury was gathering, like a storm, even darker than the drought. If you want the continuation, just say, continue. When word reached the palace that the fire had fallen on Carmel and the prophets of Baal had been destroyed, the king returned drenched from the sudden storm. But his heart remained untouched by the miracle he had witnessed. He walked through the corridors with rain dripping from his garments, a rare sight after years of drought. Servants stared in disbelief, whispering that perhaps the curse had finally lifted. But the king's expression carried not gratitude, not awe, but fear. He knew the storm that had broken over Israel was nothing compared to the storm waiting for him inside the palace. And there she stood, the queen whose presence could silence a room with a glance. Jezebel, the woman whose hatred for the God of Israel had fueled a reign of terror, listened as Ahab recounted every detail of what had happened on the mountain. But the moment she heard the final words, "The prophets of Baal are dead," a fire ignited within her that no rain could extinguish. In her eyes, this was not a miracle from God. It was an act of war from the prophet. And she responded with a declaration of vengeance so fierce it sent tremors through the palace. She swore by her gods, with venom on her tongue, that the prophet would not survive another day. She sent a messenger directly to him, not hiding her intentions behind schemes or assassins. Her words were meant to strike fear into his heart before her blade found his life. She wanted him to know she was coming. She wanted him to feel hunted. And when the message reached him, something unexpected happened, something that seemed almost impossible for a man who had confronted kings, silenced false prophets, and commanded fire from heaven. Fear gripped him, a sudden, overwhelming, suffocating fear that pierced through the confidence he had carried for so long. He had stood strong against an entire nation, but the rage of one woman broke through his spirit like a storm. He ran. He ran through valleys still wet from the rain, through dusty roads that had not yet recovered from the years of drought. He ran past villages where the sound of thunder was still being celebrated. He ran until the land of Judah extended before him, far from Jezebel's reach. But he did not stop. He continued into the wilderness, driven not by physical danger alone, but by the crushing weight of exhaustion, despair, and a heart suddenly unsure of its purpose. When he finally collapsed beneath a solitary broom tree, the man who had called down fire whispered a prayer that sounded nothing like the bold declarations he had spoken on Carmel. His voice trembled with the tiredness of a soul that had carried too much for too long. He asked not for strength, not for protection, but for death. The prophet who had stood fearless before multitudes now asked to be freed from the burden of life itself. He slept, not peacefully, but with the heaviness of a man who had surrendered to despair. The wilderness around him was silent, except for the faint whisper of the wind passing through dry branches. At that moment, it seemed as if his journey had come to its end, but heaven had not abandoned him. A touch awakened him, gentle, steady, filled with a presence that dissolved the darkness pressing against his heart. He looked up and saw not a vision, not a voice from the clouds, but an angel beside him. Before he could speak, the angel pointed to a fresh loaf baked on glowing stones and a jar of water resting at his side. No one in the wilderness could have prepared such a meal. No traveler would have carried fresh bread. No spring flowed in that desert. It was a reminder, a soft, divine whisper, that the God who sent ravens in the drought could also send angels in the despair. He ate and drank, but then he lay back down, the weight of his sorrow still heavy. The angel returned a second time, touching him with tenderness that reached deeper than words. He told him to rise, for a journey awaited him that his present strength could not sustain. And once again Elijah ate, and once again he drank. This time, something changed. The food strengthened him in a way that surpassed anything natural. And he walked for 40 days and 40 nights until he reached a mountain known not for fire and spectacle, but for something far more profound. He arrived at Horeb, the mountain of God, the same place where centuries earlier the Lord had spoken to Moses in flame and thunder. But Elijah did not stand proudly as Moses once did. He crawled into a cave, hiding from the world, hiding from the future, hiding from his own fears. And there, wrapped in silence, a voice came. Not the voice of a conqueror, not the voice of rebuke, but the voice of a God who still pursued him. "What are you doing here?" The question was not to shame him, but to draw out the pain he carried. He poured out his heart, telling God of his faithfulness, his loneliness, his fear. He spoke of how the altars were destroyed, the prophets murdered, and how he alone remained. His voice trembled with a grief that had been boiling inside him since Jezebel sent her message. The Lord told him to step out of the cave and stand on the mountain. And as he did, the world around him erupted with power. A mighty wind tore across the rocks, splitting boulders apart with violent force. Elijah felt the ground shake under the weight of an earthquake. Fire roared across the mountainside. Each display of power was magnificent, terrifying, breathtaking. Yet the prophet knew God was not in the wind. God was not in the earthquake. God was not in the fire. Then the mountain fell silent. A gentle whisper brushed against the air, so soft it might have been mist, so tender it cut deeper than thunder. It carried no force, no fury, no judgment, but it was unmistakably the presence of the one who had shaped the heavens with a word. Elijah covered his face, for in that whisper he encountered the heart of God. The Lord did not speak with anger. He spoke with purpose. He told him that he was not alone. 7,000 in Israel had not bowed to Baal, 7,000 whose faith remained unshaken. Elijah was not the last voice of truth. The nation had not fully surrendered to darkness, and his journey was far from finished. He was given new instructions: anoint kings who would reshape the political future of the region, and prepare a young man named Elisha who would inherit his mantle and carry on the prophetic mission. The God who fed him by ravens and angels now fed him with purpose. He descended from the mountain not as a broken man, but as a restored servant, carrying a renewed calling. He traveled across the wilderness until he found a young man plowing behind oxen. Elisha was not praying for a mission or seeking a sign. He was simply living his ordinary life. But destiny walked toward him in the form of a prophet whose shadow carried heaven's authority. The moment Elijah cast his cloak over him, something awakened in Elisha's spirit. Without hesitation, he left everything behind: family, farm, future, and followed the man whose footsteps echoed with divine purpose. Two lives now walked side by side, one seasoned by fire and wilderness, the other young, fresh, and hungry for the presence of God. The days ahead would shape them both, for the story of the whirlwind and the chariot of fire had not yet unfolded. The world had not yet seen the moment when heaven would descend, not with judgment, but with a celestial escort, for a man who had walked so closely with God that death itself would not touch him. Elijah walked with a quiet intensity in the days that followed, not the fiery boldness he once carried, but a mature stillness born from encounters with the Almighty. The young man who followed him, Elisha, watched every movement, every pause, every moment of prayer. He could sense that Elijah lived with one foot on the earth and the other already touching eternity. There was something different now, something in the prophet's eyes that hinted he was nearing the end of a journey few men had walked. Yet to those around him, Elijah did not speak of departure. He spoke instead of purpose, of assignments still unfinished, of people who needed to hear the voice of God. He traveled through the land, carrying a presence that brought both conviction and comfort. The people who had once followed Baal with blind devotion now listened to him with reverence, born from the memory of the fire on Carmel and the rain that followed. But the prophet did not seek praise. His heart was fixed on obedience, on finishing the path the Lord had laid before him. Elisha stayed close. Every day he learned more: how to listen for the whisper of God, how to move when heaven moved, how to speak with authority without ever claiming glory. He carried the humility of a student and the fire of a man, being prepared for a divine calling. And Elijah, who had once believed himself utterly alone, now saw in this young follower the continuation of a mission that would extend far beyond his own life. One morning, when the air held a strangeness that Elisha could not explain, Elijah began to walk with a purpose that made the ground beneath them feel like holy territory. They journeyed to Gilgal, then to Bethel, then to Jericho, and finally toward the river that had once parted for the ancestors of their faith. At each place, Elijah told Elisha to remain behind, but Elisha refused. There was something deep in his spirit that would not allow him to leave. Perhaps he sensed what Elijah had not said. Perhaps heaven whispered it to him. Perhaps loyalty itself held him like a sacred vow. But he followed step by step, refusing to be separated. Other prophets along the way looked at Elisha with somber eyes, whispering among themselves, asking if he knew that the Lord was about to take his master from him. Elisha nodded each time. He knew. But he asked them to keep silent. Some moments are too sacred for chatter, too holy for explanation. The River Jordan spread out before them, wide and fierce. Its waters had carried stories of miracles for generations, and today it was about to witness another. Elijah took the cloak that had rested on his shoulders through storms, through wilderness, through fire, through despair. He rolled it in his hands and struck the water, and the river obeyed. It opened in two, pulling back like curtains drawn aside for royalty. The two men walked across on dry ground, the sound of their footsteps echoing across the divided waters. On the other side, the air itself seemed to tremble, as though heaven was leaning close, as though the angels held their breath. Elijah turned to Elisha with a tenderness he rarely revealed. He asked what Elisha desired before he was taken. Not wealth, not fame, not protection, not power for his own sake. Elisha asked for something far deeper, the boldness of a man who understood the weight of a calling. He asked for a double portion of Elijah's spirit, not to surpass him, but to continue what God had started through him. Elijah looked at him with the solemnity of a father listening to the heart of his son. He told him it was a difficult thing, not because God could not give it, but because it required a life surrendered beyond comfort, beyond fear, beyond self. And then he said the words that would shape the rest of Elisha's destiny. If he saw Elijah when he was taken, then it would be granted. If not, it would not. They continued walking. There were no more instructions, no more warnings, no more speeches. Just two men moving forward with the quiet understanding that heaven was about to open. And then it happened. The sound came first. Not thunder, not wind, but something entirely otherworldly, like the roar of eternity breaking into time. The sky above them split with blinding glory. A chariot of fire descended, pulled by horses that blazed with celestial flames. It was not death coming for Elijah. It was honor. It was heaven's escort for a man who had walked too closely with God for the grave to claim him. The chariot rushed between the two prophets, and Elisha stumbled backward, overwhelmed by the splendor that filled the air. Elijah rose into the whirlwind, his cloak whipping in the wind, his form surrounded by the burning chariot that carried him toward the throne of the Almighty. He did not fall. He did not fade. He ascended. A man made of dust, lifted into eternity without tasting death. Elisha cried out, with a voice cracked by grief and awe, calling after the man who had become more than a teacher, more than a leader, calling after a father. The whirlwind carried Elijah beyond sight, beyond sound, beyond the world of men. And then silence returned. Only Elijah's cloak remained, drifting gently through the air until it landed at Elisha's feet. Trembling, he picked it up. The weight of it was familiar, yet now it carried something new, destiny. He walked back to the Jordan, the same river that had parted for Elijah only moments before, with a heart still raw from the loss and still burning with the promise he had been given. He held the cloak and struck the water, calling on the God of Elijah, and the river opened again. The prophets watching from a distance gasped. They saw not the absence of Elijah, but the continuation of his spirit. They saw that heaven had not abandoned Israel. They saw that the God who had commanded fire and whispered on the mountain was still moving through the world. Elijah's story did not end. It transformed, passing into the life of a young man who now carried the mantle of miracles, truth, and divine power. And somewhere beyond the boundary of human sight, Elijah rode a chariot of fire into the eternal presence of the one he had served with unwavering devotion. His journey on earth was complete, but his legacy thundered through generations, echoing in the hearts of all who dared to stand for truth, reminding the world that one life surrendered to God can change the destiny of nations. If you ever need this entire story refined, expanded, converted into voiceover, or polished